everybody. My name is Brandon Tyus, and we are at the All About Water 2022 virtual convening. And today, uh, we're going, just to give you a quick overview of everything we're going to be getting into, we're going to be creating a new level of understanding of SRF programs for community members who wish to encourage their municipality to secure such funds and include residents' voices and decisions about how to utilize funds, provide a process where local residents can begin to engage their municipal officials and understanding the residents' care about securing and best utilizing funds in their community. So we want to ensure that both residents and municipal officials know and understand the process of securing the funds and how that process may be different in 2022 and are aware of the timing of different procedures throughout the application process to create a common understanding of what the funds can be used for. Again, my name is Brandon Tyus. I'm a community program associate with Freshwater Future. And today, the speakers who will be assisting us in communicating this today will be a senior advisor and technical assistance and community engagement, Jonathan Nelson from the EPA. And then we have, from a community perspective, from Low Country Alliance, from Models Community, Executive Director Omar Muhammad, along with Brian Peckinpah from the Public Affairs, and Monica Daniels from the Capital Asset Department, both from Detroit Water and Sewage Department, along with our Executive Director, Jill Ryan, and for advocacy, Monica Lewis Patrick from We the People of Detroit, and Michael Harris from the Flint Community Lab. So it's jam-packed with a lot of great speakers and powerful messages. And to ensure that everybody gets a great welcome, I would like to first welcome our Executive Director, Jill, and leaving us for some welcoming comments. Lastly, before I get into that though, my main job today is going to be keeping track of time and making sure we're all on task and that we respect everybody's time to the utmost. So Jill, did you have anything?
Thanks, Brandon. It's great to have you emceeing, and it's great to see all these amazing faces from across the region here. We have expect a good turnout today. And so because we have many voices on the call, which is wonderful, if you'll just manage your mute and stay muted unless you're asking a question or something, that would help everybody to be able to hear better. The meeting will be until noon. And so if you manage your own needs in terms of taking a break, we're going to sort of power through this because we want to save the maximum time for Q&A with the great speakers we have on today. So if you have any concerns or questions, you can put those in the chat, and we'll be watching for those. But just a huge welcome to everybody who's here. A huge thank you to our speakers for taking the time to come and share their expertise with everyone. And a huge thank you to our community members from across the region for being here because you care about your community and you want to make sure these dollars are spent in ways that help move you forward for clean and affordable water. With that, I think I'll turn it back to you, Brandon, and we can get going.
Absolutely. So without further ado, I really do we hope that everybody enjoys this to the maximum benefit of what we're providing today. And I would like to open up a space for the senior advisor with the EPA, Jonathan Nelson, to discuss what activities and projects the SRF funds could be spent on. So Jonathan, could you please share with us?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
I can hear you great.
All right. Well, thank you to Freshwater Future for organizing this event and for inviting us. But more importantly, thank you everyone for being here, because we know you're all busy. So it means a lot for you to take your time to join this kind of event. I was getting some looks in the office this morning, because it's not often I, dress all the way up, but these kinds of meetings are the most important meetings to me. So I really do appreciate being here. So we're going to talk about a really important law that we have a lot of work to do to implement effectively for our communities. It's the bipartisan infrastructure law. Before I jump in, just briefly on myself. So before I came to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, I worked at a community-based environmental justice organization called the Community Water Center, where I was able to meet folks like Jill. We've got Monica Lewis Patrick on, which is also why I had to dress up and look good. The work that we did at Community Water Center was focused on very small, very rural communities, mostly farm worker communities, many of which have not had access to water for years or decades. My family also does not have safe water. They're served by a small water system in the Central Valley of California. So like for many of us, this work is personal. So I really do appreciate everyone being here. We'll bring that perspective into this conversation. I'm going to try to power through these slides as quickly as I can so that we have as much time as possible for Q&A, and Jill and Brandon just chime in if I'm going off track. So we can go to the next slide. All right, so this is what we plan to go through today. We're going to start with a little bit about what is this bipartisan infrastructure bill, or bill for short. What can bill funding be used for? And we'll share some specific tangible examples of that so we can make this real. We'll talk a bit about how does bill funding get to communities, and what are EPA's goals for implementation, as well as I want to share some of the challenges that we are going to face. It's important to be honest about those so that we can work to address them, and then just give you a sneak preview for what is next with bill implementation, and a few thoughts about how you may be able to get involved. So we can go to the next slide. So the bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed last August by Congress. It goes by a few different names. I'm going to refer to it as either the bipartisan infrastructure bill or just BIL, bill for short. But some of the other names that you may have seen in the news over the last year or so are names like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the bipartisan infrastructure deal. But we'll just call it bill for short today, which stands for bipartisan infrastructure bill. If we go to the next slide, there's a few things right off the bat there are important to make sure that everyone's aware of in terms of what is in the bipartisan infrastructure bill and what is it. So first things first, the bill provides $50 billion, roughly $50 billion to the EPA for water infrastructure, drinking water, wastewater, other water needs. And that's a lot of money. That is the most funding ever for water infrastructure, and we know we need it. Part of what is really important about the bill is not just the amount of funding, which is a lot, but the type of funding. In the past, the majority of funding has been, in fact, most funding has typically been in the form of loans. Well, with bill, a large amount of the funding will be grants, not loans, almost half of the funding. So that's really important. We'll talk more about that. The other thing that's important to know that we'll also talk about more in a minute is that we are really going to try to target this grant funding to the communities that need it most. So I'm going to be using a term, disadvantaged communities, in this presentation because that term is very important for how states will be deciding how they utilize this grant funding. I want to acknowledge, though, that many of us have real problems with the term disadvantaged communities for very obvious reasons, but because of the way the law is written and some technicalities, I'm going to use this phrase, disadvantaged communities. Couple last things to be aware of. We have a 5-year runway to get funding out the door. That is important because in the past, we haven't had as much time to be able to get large amounts of infrastructure funding out to communities. So we've got 5 years, that's going to fly, but that gives us a little time to get organized. And then lastly, and we'll talk about this throughout this presentation, most of the funding in the bill, most of the water funding is going to be distributed through what are called state revolving funds, or SRFs. And state revolving funds are basically like a state bank account. Each state has a drinking water state bank account and a wastewater bank account, state bank account that will receive this bill infrastructure funding. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. If we go to the next slide, this next slide is very important. And I know there's a lot of information on it. So I'm just going to start on the left column and we'll work our way right. So there are 5 important pots of money that are going to be flowing to the states in these state revolving fund bank accounts that I just mentioned, or SRF bank accounts for short. So I'm going to just tick through each of the 5, but I'll explain what they mean. So at the top left, we have clean water, SRF supplemental. That's just a fancy way of saying wastewater funding. So we have about $11.7 billion for wastewater funding that is going to be flowing to all 50 states. We also, right below that, we have the drinking water SRF supplemental. That is what it sounds like, $11.7 billion for drinking water needs that will be flowing to all of the states. Below that, we have clean water emerging contaminants funding. That is going to be for addressing some of the emerging contaminants we're seeing in the wastewater space, things like, well, everything from PFAS to microplastics to pharmaceuticals, and there's some others. $1 billion for that will be flowing to the states. Below that, we have drinking water emerging contaminants. That is really about addressing PFAS contamination for the most part, $4 billion flowing to the states. And then lastly, this is what it sounds like, $15 billion to address lead issues. This group knows as much as any the importance of that funding. If you then look at the state match column, we included this mainly just to help everyone understand that states do have to chip in for some of these funding sources, a little bit of money, but we have reduced in some cases how much funding states have to chip in. And in other cases, for example, if you look at that bottom row, drinking water lead funding, $15 billion, the federal government's covering that entirely. We're really trying to reduce the burden on states so we can get this money to communities that need it. The last 2 columns on the right are very important. When you see the word additional subsidy, that's the technical term for grants. So additional subsidy means grants. The other way to say grants in this world is forgivable loans. So when you look at that top row, when we say there's $11.7 billion for clean water, SRF supplemental or wastewater needs, what we're saying is 49% of that funding is going to be for grants. And then if you look at the last row right next to it, the bill sets out stipulations for who can receive that additional subsidy or that grant funding. And in some cases, in most cases, most of that grant funding, again, is targeted specifically to disadvantaged communities, and that was intentional. All right, I know that was a lot of information on this slide. If we go to the next slide, we'll breeze through this one pretty quick. This just gives you a sense of how the money will be flowing over the 5 years. Each state will receive 1/5 of their funding every year. So we're divvying it out in chunks to help be able to implement it. If you go to the next slide, this slide is important for a couple of reasons. but mainly because we're trying to get really into the brass tacks of what can you use this funding for? So these are just some examples. They're definitely not exhaustive, but some examples of what this funding can be used for is lead service line replacement, drinking water, treatment plant upgrades, putting in new pipes where we need to for drinking water, in some cases building entirely new drinking water infrastructure. On the wastewater side, again, same thing, being able to provide upgrades where we need to, or entirely new infrastructure where we need to. The next slide is really important in, for example, small rural communities. Many of the communities that I'd worked with over the years, farm worker communities, have been pushed to the margins of larger communities due to redlining and other injustices. And they may be within hundreds of feet of a larger community that does have safe water. So there's funding to be able to connect these communities into other communities to provide more safe and reliable and affordable water. Stormwater projects important in the East and Midwest, and water conservation projects important in the West, which is in a severe drought. And then finally, funding can be used to address PFAS contamination challenges, which we're seeing across the country. So these are just some tangible brass tacks examples of how you can use this funding. If we go to the next slide, again, there's a lot of information on the slide, but we've really actually already talked about the first three bullets. You know, that we talked about the first bullet, which is how each state has basically two bank accounts that will receive this bill funding: a drinking water state revolving fund account and a clean water state revolving fund account. And we talked about how there is going to be, in some cases, a little bit of state funding that needs to be kicked in, but it's been reduced and in some cases eliminated entirely to help relieve the burden on states so that they can do the job they need to do. I want to stress the last two bullets though on this slide. So the second to last is very, very important. And you're going to be talking about this throughout the morning today. That is that states implement and operate their state revolving funds. So we are going to be providing this funding to the states. And we do have some role, but states, for example, set the definition of disadvantaged communities. And that is how the law works. Congress authorizes and requires the states to set the definitions of disadvantaged communities. And I know you'll be talking about that today, and I'll mention that a little more in just a minute. States also develop what's called their intended use plan, which is really just a fancy way of saying how are they going to spend the money. And states set their application processes and procedures for how you apply for the funding. What the EPA does is we provide the funding, we provide some overall guidance, which I'll talk about in a minute. Although I've already shared some, we're being very clear that grant funding for the most part needs to go to disadvantaged communities, but I'll talk more about the guidance that we'll be providing in a minute. And we have some level of oversight ability. The last thing that's important to know is that local agencies are the ones that are going to be developing the applications for that they'll send to their states to request this bill funding. So think water systems or other local governments in your community. And there are opportunities for you to get involved in that process. And we also know that there's challenges there. So I'll close out by talking a bit about that. But just for sake of time, if we go to the next slide. So there are many goals, as you can imagine, with this bill funding when we're talking about $50 billion. But there's also some very, very, very important goals that I want to just stress from our perspective with this audience, and that we are stressing with everyone, and this includes the states. So first and foremost, we intend to work as hard as we can to target this funding to the communities that need it most. Our communities of color, our underserved and economically distressed communities, our indigenous communities. These are the communities that need to tap into their fair share of this funding. And we know that's going to take real work, but that is our most important goal. And I want to stress that, again, that 49% of funding that I talked about, that's grant funding with some of the biggest funding pots, that 11.7 billion in drinking water funding, 11.7 billion in wastewater funding, that 49% of grant funding is going to be targeted to disadvantaged communities. That's important. The second goal to stress is we want to make real progress on removing lead service lines. $15 billion is available to do that. That's going to allow us to take a big step forward to the goal, President Biden's goal of removing 100% of lead service lines. And then lastly, we want to use the funding that is provided through bill that to address these forever chemicals called PFAS chemicals that we're finding across the country. We know we have a lot of work to tackle those forever chemicals, and we have real funding to do so. If we go to the next slide, so I think, you know, we have to be and are optimists to be in this work, but it's also important to be very clear-eyed that there are going to be challenges, and to lean into those challenges from the outset, and to work, you know, days, nights, weekends to address these challenges. So I want to share just a few of the challenges that we are going to face to be able to effectively implement this $50 billion of water infrastructure funding provided through the bill. The first is, and this group knows this as much as any other group, we know that our underserved communities just, in most cases, do not have the capacity to be able to hustle for this funding the way that a big community, a more resource community is going to be able to do. So we recognize that, and we're going to have to address those challenges. And that's not going to be easy, but that is a top priority. The second challenge that I want to flag for this group, and I think many of you are already aware of it, is that, and I already said it, but states set the definitions of disadvantaged communities. So states set the definition, just, you know, simple as that. And those definitions can vary from state to state. Now, one thing, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but EPA is going to do in terms of providing feedback and guidance is we are going to very strongly encourage states to revisit, when necessary, their definitions of disadvantaged communities, so that we can make sure that underserved communities are truly being captured by each state's definition of disadvantaged community. So I'll share a little bit more about that in a minute. The last thing I'll flag is, and this gets to the first bullet, but we know that communities are going to need technical assistance. And by technical assistance, I mean everything from, we're going to have to identify the communities that may need help writing their application for SRF funding. We're going to need to help them do that. And then in some cases, we may need to help a community after they submit their funding application. We may need to help them project manage their project. There are a lot of communities that are going to need technical assistance. We are going to have some funding this year that is meaningful, but it's also only going to be a start. So we're going to have to recognize that there's a lot of communities that are going to need technical assistance, and we're going to have to be really strategic and targeted in how we do that. All right, a couple more slides, and then I want to open it up for conversation and questions. So here's what's coming up for bill implementation, what's next. I talked about how we're going to be providing guidance to the states and feedback and direction. So in the near future, EPA will be releasing what is going to be called a bill SRF implementation memo to the states to provide our direction for how to implement this $50 billion. Now, in some cases, like I already shared, states have are charged with certain responsibilities that we cannot sort of directly shape or at least sort of dictate. That state definition of disadvantaged communities is an example. What we can do is get very creative in how we can help support states to think about whether they need to revise their definition of disadvantaged communities. So we're going to be providing guidance around that. The other thing to be aware of is in the past, whenever EPA has provided guidance to the states for infrastructure funding, it's often been a document that's really just gone, that hasn't necessarily been publicly available. This document is going to be made publicly available because we think this needs to be a conversation with everyone. So that'll be coming out in the near future. I encourage everyone to look at that document. Number two, we are developing a technical assistance strategy. Like I said, we'll have some technical assistance resources. We're gonna have to stretch every dollar because it's not gonna be enough. So a big part of what we're gonna need to do is leverage the funding we have with the funding that states are able to tap into for technical assistance. We're also gonna wanna have community conversations so that you can help shape our technical assistance strategy. My last slide actually has a couple of questions on that. Later this year in the fall, states will receive their first allotment of funding. That's important to know. Each state has a different process for how they create their plan each year for that infrastructure funding. I think you may be talking about that today. And then lastly, we're gonna really want to maximize our limited ability to do outreach and education because it's a big country. And so we're going to do as much outreach and education as we can, but we're going to need partnership in that. So if we go to I believe this is almost my last slide. Here's a couple thoughts to think about. And I believe you're going to be spending the rest of the day, talking about how can the community engage in your state SRF funding processes. The first is these are public processes. Each state, when they develop their process, it is a public process. Local agencies also have public processes. So that's a space to get involved. We know many of you are seeking to do so. We also recognize that doing so can be very challenging. So we want to hear ideas to support that participation. I spent years working with community members to support their engagement in these processes. I understand how difficult they are. We want to hear about what are the ways that we can help support that necessary public engagement. Second, I talked about technical assistance. These are some of the questions that we are thinking through, that we invite feedback. And Jill and your team, we welcome everyone on this call to work with Jill to think about these questions, because these are tough questions. Questions like, how can we move to a different way of helping communities? In the past, we've waited for a community many times to raise their hand and say, I need help. How can we shift that burden of asking for technical assistance off of underserved communities? How can we be more proactive? And what are just tangible ways we can better support communities within the resources that we have and the restrictions we have? We want to get as creative as possible. And that includes both supporting more communities to understand this historic opportunity and supporting local and state governments. So that's my last slide. I do want to just close on a real note of optimism here, which is that 2 years ago, we could have not imagined having $50 billion for water infrastructure, much less that, close to half of that would be grants. This is a transformative opportunity. We know that this is not alone going to solve all of our water challenges, because we have decades and longer of challenges to address, but it's going to help us take a big step forward. Implementation is going to be challenging. We want to be honest about that so that we can lean into addressing those challenges, but we have an opportunity to take a big step forward. We're going to work days, nights, weekends to do our part to serve your communities, to make sure that your family and mine can have safe water. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Brandon and Jill. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that presentation. Some very heavy hitting information, some information that was very enlightening for some and refreshing for others. And we appreciate this information. And Now, as we move into the next portion, we're actually going to open up the space to Q&A. We have some questions. I've been filling up the chat box, and we would like to our group to have that space. It'll be a little over 10 minutes. We will be concluding the Q&A at about 10:15. But if you would like to share a question, you can most certainly raise your hand. And it looks like I'll share the first question that came up in the chat box is, will the disadvantaged communities be defined the same as SRF processes with Eagle, from Monica Daniels?
I am not sure I'm familiar with Eagle. I apologize. I can follow up on that. What I will say is that states are mandated to set their definition of disadvantaged communities in the context of this state revolving fund water infrastructure funding. And like I said, every state sort of has their spin on how they define that. And depending on how they define that, we know there are real challenges. And I think Jill and others are going to talk more about that this morning. We are planning to really engage with the states, recognizing we can't tell them what to do. They set the definition, but we're going to really encourage them strongly to look at their definition of disadvantaged communities in this context of state revolving fund funding. And we've got some other, when you see this document that we put out in the near future, you're going to see a lot of thinking and emphasis on this issue. But I don't know if Jill, you want to chime in on that.
Yeah, that you're exactly right, Jonathan. First of all, thank you for your great presentation. We appreciate that. And a lot of people have questions on this very topic. And I will say that we're going to address that throughout the morning, including we have developed with the All About Water Coalition that's hosting this meeting, a definition that we think is more along the lines of what EPA is intending to get these funds out. In Michigan, Eagle's traditional definition, I believe, has been 10,000 or less people on the system. And that's not really what we're looking for. So we'll introduce that definition from All About Water later in the call. And this is one of the things that we definitely believe is something that every community can engage with their state on. So there are opportunities for advocacy with your community, but also with the states on topics just like this.
Absolutely. And for the next question, this will be from Monica Lewis Patrick with People of Detroit. And her question is, can you share places and or communities that are doing a great job of working with communities to develop and increase the success of utilizing SRF dollars?
Yeah, great question. All of Monica's questions are usually great. So thank you, Monica, for all the work you do. The last thing I do want to just briefly go back to what Jill was talking about, though, around looking at state definitions of disadvantaged communities. Cannot stress enough how important that is. The document that we're putting out in the near future, this bill implementation memo to the states, is a document that I encourage everyone on this call to read once that's made available. And I will make sure that we get this document out, Jill, to you so that you can spread it with this group. So going to Monica's question, the short answer is we want to do a better job of finding those communities where we can lift them up as a model. Communities that are practicing community-driven solutions, community-centered processes that are resulting in safe water projects and wastewater projects. I welcome examples of those communities. The one thing I'll say is the work that I did and where I was able to meet great advocates like Jill and Monica was there is some good examples out west of communities that organized and around what they believe the needs were able to secure assistance and were able to advance community-driven projects. So the examples are out there. We need to do a better job of lifting those stories up though, so that other way other parts of the country, other communities can benefit. And we also need to find those communities. So I welcome you all to help us find those communities where you're aware of communities where it's working.
Absolutely. And I just would like to highlight Commissioner Adams and Monica both agree. Benton Harbor has been doing a fantastic job as leading that example. Benton Harbor had been a huge support to the city of Benton Harbor in ensuring that testing samples were submitted and the community was educated on best practices on lead. So I definitely agree. There are examples in the community. I just believe the next step was just making sure that we have an open communication and letting them lead the front line because they know what works in their community. And
note to folks, Brandon, if anyone has ideas for where these great cities are, you can send that to any of us here at Freshwater Future, and we'll make sure to get them over to Jonathan and his team, just to make that easy.
Absolutely. And I actually have another question from Mike Schreberg. Is it required to be 49% to be grants for SRF, or is it the maximum amount allowed?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is required. That is the amount of funding that will be grant funding. So that's different than in the past where there was a ceiling. And as we know, we didn't always reach that ceiling of grant funding. And by the way, that ceiling for grant funding in the past was much lower too. This is 49% of funding will be grant or forgivable loan funding. As we know, because of the affordability challenges that many of our communities face, this will be able to be transformative because it is grant funding that can cover the full cost of a project.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question from Laura Rubin. Does the EPA provide guidance or are there public engagement standards for the local planning processes?
So this is a great question. And I know this group through your lived experience knows why this question is so important. I spent years struggling with why you're asking this question. What I'll say is we want to put some thought into how we can help support thinking about best practices for public engagement. What I would also say is that there are organizations out there that have really put intentional thought into how you into what good standards for local planning processes look like. So I think part of what I see as opportunity, and one thing I want to name that I didn't name when I mentioned that the implementation challenges, we have yet to hire any new staff at EPA to implement this $50 billion in funding. There's different reasons for that. And there's a couple new people like me that are on the team, but most of our staff that are doing this work, they already had day jobs. And then we said, here's $50 billion of funding to implement. So I think part of what we're trying to figure out is across all this array of challenges, what can we leverage or build on good work that's already being done? So I'll just say I appreciate this question. And we do want to think through how we can help lift up best practices on this. And if there are best practices you all are aware of, I encourage you to share those, again, with Jill. So thank you for that question.
Absolutely. And just to reiterate again, yes, please send it if you have any information to share with Jonathan. And I know that Monica, Daniels, you had your hand raised. Did you have any input?
It was someone asked a question about EGLE, and I was just going to say that EGLE is the State of Michigan Environmental Great Lakes. I'm missing a portion of it, but that's the leg of the state of Michigan that does the SRF funding.
Yeah, that's right. And I believe, Jill, you had said the way that they set their definition for disadvantaged communities in Michigan is 10,000, population 10,000 or less. one thing I'll just again reiterate is I really encourage everyone to read this implementation memo we're sending to the states, because we talk about different ways that we think states need to think about assessing their definition of disadvantaged community, recognizing that when we're talking about communities that need assistance, it's really about affordability and capacity. So how are we highlighting those communities? So I encourage everyone to read that implementation memo when it comes out in the near future.
Wonderful advice. And thank you again, Jonathan, for your presentation. One last question. Will your slides be available to everybody on this call or webinar?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am following up on that. The short answer is that's my answer, is I am following up on that, but I knew someone was going to ask. I'll also say that we want to and know that we need to put out other kinds of information to help communities digest this, like fact sheets. So again, we welcome, Jill, you and other folks to help inform that. And then I will follow up, Jill, with you about the slides.
Fantastic.
Excuse me, and I was just wanted to ask a quick question. That memo that Jonathan just mentioned about sending to the state, how are we in these individual agencies and groups able to access that memo?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is there's going to be some work to try to move that around beyond in the past where it's typically gone, which is just to the state sort of SRF programs. But I am also going to make sure I've got a long list of people that I'm going to be sending it to directly, and Jill is on that list. So this group will be able to access it through Jill at a minimum. We'll also be posting it on our website.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, and thanks for the question, Horst. We will definitely share that with this group and beyond to make sure everybody has access.
Absolutely. And if anybody has any other questions, feel free to send it to me. I'll put my email in the chat. Alana, actually, could you do that, please? My email in the chat. And if you have any questions, I'll be sure to get those over to Jonathan. And again, thank you, Jonathan. But we're going to be moving on to the next portion and this time for about 20 minutes, we're going to be learning about SRF 101 from a community perspective. So now I would like to introduce the Executive Director of Low Country Alliance for Model Communities. His name is Omar Muhammad. Again, he's got about 20 minutes to share. Omar, when you're ready, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Excellent.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Good. I'm gonna keep my camera off because my internet is unstable. So I'm going, at least where I'm at, it's not the best. So, okay, cool. You got my slides. Okay. I had them ready to share. Okay, cool. Just a little bit about the Low Country Alliance for Model Communities. We are a grassroots organization in the city of North Charleston. We were formed by the residents of the communities to address quality of life concerns around environmental justice, housing, economic development, education, quality of life concerns. And our organization was formed to begin to address those issues and concerns. So we were able to, as an organization, use some national laws, one being the National Environmental Policy Act, to secure funding for our organization to address those core areas. But today, I was asked to give a brief overview of the state revolving fund and how that can be used to address infrastructure needs in communities. And I also added an additional slide, but you may not have that, Titus. But I will provide an overview of Justice 40 and how Justice 40 ties into infrastructure improvements, infrastructure needs for communities, and also give an overview of some community-based organizations that I think will be beneficial for the communities that are present today to investigate and get to know. Next slide, please. So just a basic understanding about what is community development. I think before we can begin to look for funding or understanding what funding is available to address issues and concerns in communities, in this case, it's water infrastructure needs in communities, we first have to understand what is community development or how the community defines community development. And this definition should be all encompassing, including everything in a neighborhood that involves its housing, its aesthetics, its economics, particularly for low wealth communities and neighborhoods. This is vital to define this early on, so that as you approach revitalization strategies and your end goals on addressing those challenges in your communities, that you have a way of measuring impact or measuring efficiency of the work that is being done in a community. And 4 elements, at least what we have found to be valuable for us when we are considering community development in communities. Those elements are, what are the needs and desires of the neighborhoods and communities, right? Sometimes we have this top-down approach where we think that we have all the solutions for a community, but we're not addressing their immediate needs. So first we need to identify those needs and desires in the community or a particular neighborhood around their needs and their desires. And then these efforts, these conversations, these strategies, these meetings need to be community-led, right? We need to see ourselves as being technical advisors, consultants to communities and guiding them in ways in which they can begin to lead the efforts, right? To begin to address the issues of concern. So we need to allow these processes to be led by the community and informed by the community needs and desires. We need to focus on self-help processes and what are we doing? How are we approaching the work that at the end of the process, we tap into the power that already exists in communities. That power where they can amplify their voice and become the advocates that they need to address the issues and concerns in their communities. And then lastly, everyone involved in this process or in the conversation need to have a collective vision and shared goal about the process in which we want to work towards or work within, and the end goals. And all that should be collectively agreed upon and shared among all the stakeholders involved in the conversation. Next slide, please. So what, and I know, and I apologize for this being redundant if the prior speaker have already covered most of this, but and I won't spend a lot of time on this because I'm pretty sure the presenter before me have already introduced many of these concepts. But the State Revolving Fund is a program that provides low interest rate loans for the building and the repair of infrastructure. So that's water infrastructure, that's drinking water infrastructure. It could be stormwater improvement projects. Those funds are available at the state level. The federal government provides those funds for the state to be able to distribute as a loan out to municipalities to begin to address those infrastructure needs in their communities. Next slide, please. The money from this, from this program is made available through the servicing of existing loans. So this is almost like a revolving loan where money is lent that money is hopefully recaptured with interest so that it can be distributed to other groups for continued use. And each state has its own process in which it follows. So it's important that community groups, when we are looking for this type of funding, that we understand what the state process is for allocation of those funds, applying for those funds, and if there are relationships that communities can build with the municipalities or the organizations that qualify to apply for those funds. How can community groups begin to forge those type of relationships, build those relationships in which those funds can be directed to their communities to address concerns in their communities for water infrastructure needs. Next slide, please. So what type of projects that can be funded? These could be construction of municipal water facilities. It could be controlling non-point sources of water pollution. It can be used to build a wastewater treatment system, right? Create green infrastructure. A lot of people forget about this one, that those funds could be used to create green infrastructure projects, deal with flooding issues in communities, to protect estuaries, and to also fund water quality projects. These are the types of projects that those funds are looking to support and to provide funding to advance those projects. Next slide, please. This here is just a tool that I found on EPA's website. What this tool allows people to do to begin to look at the financing options that are available for their infrastructure projects, and what type of assistance borrowers may be able to look at all the options that are available to them when they're looking at infrastructure improvement projects that they want to begin to address their issues and concerns. And I believe this is the last slide that I have here, but correct, Brandon? I think it is. I believe it is. I'm going to talk a little bit now about Justice 40 and how Justice 40, the role that I believe, okay, that's just a infographic that shows the impact that state revolving funds have had across the United States, how they were able to leverage the different types of funding that is available to communities. Every dollar that has been invested in communities, they were able to have a return of $3.10. And this is basically pulled from the EPA's website about their investment and the leveraging of that investment. That's the last slide, I believe. So I want to have some conversation, or at least begin a conversation with this group about how Justice 40 plays a role in infrastructure improvements. As we all are aware, the Biden administration has made a huge commitment to providing the resources, the technical support to disadvantaged communities. And I know that there's a huge debate going around this community about what disadvantage means. And I think, again, I go back to communities must self-define what disadvantage means, or what environmental justice means for their communities. That must be a local definition that funders, government, municipalities must be able to respond to those self-determined definitions, and the flexibility within policy, the flexibility within funding must be there to respond appropriately to those varying definitions that will be across communities. So I think that is important to stress here. Two, we know that they are making available funds for not only infrastructure projects, right? So we have to think about our water infrastructure projects as being part of infrastructure, right? It's just not roads and bridges and the like. It is also water infrastructure projects. It is also broadband. We have to look at broadband as being an infrastructure in our communities, and how we can tap into the Justice 40 funding to provide those necessary infrastructure needs in our community. So we have to think beyond what the typical ideas and thoughts around what infrastructure is. So for communities, it is important. There are accelerators called Justice 40 accelerators. You can Google that, and there are organizations across the country that are participating in environmental justice accelerators. These accelerators are designed to assist communities' ability to access the funding from the federal government that is allocated for Justice 40's priorities, right? When we look at Justice 40, the funding is at least 40%, of the federal dollars allocated for climate change, allocated for climate concerns, and allocated for equity and justice concerns. At least 40% of those funds have been identified as being necessary for those funds to flow into grassroots on the ground communities, right? But we know, and history has shown, that our communities are typically left out when that type of funding hit cities and hit states. Our communities are the last to receive those funds. So we have to be having those conversations now with those decision makers, not only the federal government, but our state government, our local government, and our municipalities, about when those fundings hit the state, where do we want, how do we prioritize those projects in our communities, and where we want to see those Justice 40 dollars go. We must have a plan. We cannot wait for those fundings to hit the state legislature, and then we think that we can start allocating for those dollars. We should have been having those conversations when Justice 40 was an idea, because other groups were. Right. So I highly encourage community groups to find those organizations that are part of the Justice 40 accelerators and begin conversations with them about partnerships, alliances, networks, and how you can collaborate to get those dollars into communities where they are needed and where they were allocated to have the most impact. I also want to share with this group about some national organizations that I think will be beneficial for groups to follow up with. You have Thriving Earth Exchange. Thriving Earth Exchange is a network of scientists who are there to assist communities begin to look at their issues and concerns and how they can begin to address those issues and concerns. It could be collecting the data that is necessary for you to tell your story. It could be how can you find the funding to be able to address a specific issue in your community. So Thriving Earth Exchange is really a good organization to speak with. The other organization is it's called the Environmental Protection Network. This is a network of ex-EPA employees. They will be able to help you navigate the bureaucracy of government. Identify those regulations and those tools necessary for you to begin to address issues and concerns in your community. Then there is national organizations. There's the U.S. Climate Network. That is a group of organizations across the country that is trying to address climate change in communities. And then you have the Friends of the Earth. Friends of the Earth is another organization that is looking to do more work around environmental justice, and they provide funding to organizations to begin to address those issues and concerns in their communities. So Brandon, I'm going to stop there, and I know there's probably some questions in the last 15 minutes or so that we have. I believe we have about 10 or 15 more minutes, I believe.
That is correct, Omar. Thank you for your presentation and the recommendations on other organizations that partners could connect with. And Monica also posted the Justice 40 accelerators. Therefore, as we open up for questions and answers, if anybody has any questions as a reminder, you can always raise your hand and I'll be more than happy to pick on you so you can ask that question. The question, Omar, that I have in the chat right now is from Monica. It is Lewis Patrick. It is asking, how can we ensure that dollars once allocated to the local municipality reach disadvantaged communities? And again, she asks you to please share any examples of workforce development strategies for jobs, contracts, trainings, and programs for most impacted communities. Are you there? You hear the question? You're on mute if you're speaking. Okay, so it seems like Omar, if you are speaking, we are unable to hear you. And from there, I can give you a couple more moments as I'm speaking, but maybe we can get to those questions and answers at a later time, or if anybody has any questions that you would like to get out to Omar, again, you can most certainly send them to me and I can ensure that those messages are sent to him. Again, as I'm speaking, Omar, if you're able to hop in, I would love to finish your Q&A session. Otherwise, we're going to be moving into the section called Sharing Past Experience with SRF. So these are going to be public officials of the city of Detroit who are going to be mentioning, their process and their experience as they've applied for those dollars for their community residents. So I believe Monica Daniels, she is part of the capital asset department. I do see that Omar may have joined us again. Omar, are you with us? We're still available for your Q&A if you are. Okay. All right, then no issues. Again, you can most certainly send me an email. But Monica, could you please, I would like to open the space for you. Welcome.
Good morning. I'm Monica Daniels. I'm the Finance Asset Manager for DWSD, which is the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. And we are an agency of the city. We're an enterprise agency of the city of Detroit. We are somewhat separate. Our funding comes from our ratepayers when they pay their water and sewage and drainage bills. That is how we generate our revenue. We're not part of the general fund of the city. As that, we do have some funding needs. And I hear a lot talk about the disadvantaged communities. And I did mention that for SRF funding, we apply through the state of Michigan, and the state of Michigan's department is called EGLE, EGLE, which is the Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy Group of EGLE, and that's where we apply for funding. And when we apply, they typically have a portion that is loan forgiveness. So if I apply for a $10 million loan, there's a possibility that $1 million of that would be forgiven. And it's forgiven as part of a subsidy program. So Congress, and forgive me for not knowing all the legislative particulars on this, but I do know that as a requirement, the state does have to subsidize funding for disadvantaged communities up to 25% of the amounts that they give out. And loan forgiveness is one way that the state of Michigan does that with the loan forgiveness. And at DWSD, we in the past typically have gone out for bonds on the market, and those tend to be maybe 3% interest or higher. And it's somewhat, I'm not going to say easy to get, but it's a little easier than SRF. But the advantage of applying with SRF is the loan forgiveness. The slide that you see here this is a slide taken from one of my board presentations. So again, when we apply for loans, I do have to present it to our board and let them know what we're going to do. Part of the SRF process is we have to have a public hearing. So anytime we apply for a loan, the steps are you have to prepare a project plan. A project plan, we typically use the engineering group or outside consultant to prepare that for us because it gives the particulars of the project, what the need is, justification, the community that will be affected and how and why. And for me, being an accountant, the how and why is we have a critical asset that is failing or continues to fail, meaning a water infrastructure where we have water main breaks that happen, quite often in going by the linear feet. If you have more than 5 breaks in a 1,000 linear feet, more than once in 5 years, then it's starting to deteriorate. That's just my accounting way of explaining to you what a critical asset is, just to kind of keep it short. But again, when we apply, the hardest part is coming up with the project plan, working with the engineers, and then we do have to have a public hearing, and that public hearing has to be in a publication 30 days prior. And that's what you see the steps here. This was the last one that I did. So if we had to submit to Eagle by July 1st. So in order to meet that July 1st deadline, we have to, back up to when we had we published our public notice in the newspaper. So when I say the newspaper, we did it in our, Detroit Free Press. That's the main publication of news in the city of Detroit. We also have some local newspapers. Michigan Chronicle is another one. We put it on our website. We do have community meetings, like the neighborhood groups in the communities where the project is going to happen. We share that information in those groups. The council members for that particular district, we share that information with them. And the reason why it's important also to share it with them is because any project that we have that's over $5 million, we have to get city council approval. So if you include them on the public hearing, they hear about the project, they get to come and ask their questions, so that when you go on to city council for approval, it's a little easier because you socialized it with them and they understand. And then going back to this, we have a public hearing. What's required in a public hearing is to let the community know what the purpose of the project is, how is it going to benefit the citizens, and then also, what is the impact on their rates? And that is a key question. Typically a $10 million project will have like a 0.25% increase on the rates. So that's, about 10 cents, I guess. And so we have the public hearing, and I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the history of DWSD and Great Lakes Water Authority, but in 2013, the city of Detroit had filed for bankruptcy, and part of that bankruptcy, coming out of bankruptcy, the water department was split into two. We have the local system, which serves just the city of Detroit residents, and then we have the suburban community. Our infrastructure, serves several different suburban communities in Southwest Detroit, and that was split off and formed a new regional authority called GLWA, or Great Lakes Water Authority. So January 1st, 2016, we had a bifurcation where we did the split. And please believe me, it wasn't that easy. I was part of that transformation team, and we had to go through and identify all of the assets. We have 5 water treatment plants, 9 pump stations, and we had to divide all those things and all the assets that go with it, all the machinery. There's some fallout about vehicles, who had what vehicle, but it was a task, and we did that again, January 1st, 2016. So because of that, we have a $50 million lease agreement where the Great Lakes Water Authority pays DWSD for the use of those assets, $50 million every year, and we commit that to our capital. And it does not always meet the needs of our infrastructure. And then again, with the lease agreement that we have to pledge our receivables, meaning when our customers pay their bill, we have to pledge our receivables to handle the debt that was prior to our bifurcation. And so that we have to apply any loans that we apply for, we have to go through GLWA. That's why you see them part of our approval process. Another interesting thing as far as the SRF process is you have to provide notification to SHPO, and I might get this wrong, but it's the state fish and wildlife organizations. The Indian tribes, anytime you're going to dig, you have to give them notification. And what has been challenging for us this last 2 years is that those organizations are asking a lot more questions. They're a lot more concerned about what impact the work you're doing is doing to the environment. Every time you dig, again with the Indian tribes, you have to make sure that you're not disturbing any ancient burial grounds. You're not near any of them, and anything that you do won't impact that in any way. And again, these organizations are growing and they're getting more technical and they're asking a lot of questions. And as part of the public hearing, when you get that public hearing notice, you also are opening the door for any public comment, and public comments do come from these organizations and it comes from the community. Sorry. And let's see. So after we have our public hearing, there's we do have to have transcripts of that public hearing. And when I say transcripts, just think of like a stenographer, or you know, when they take the notes when you go to court. We typically just get someone like that because they take the best notes. And that transcript then comes part of our packet. When I say our packet, we have a project plan that outlines and says what the project is, what we're going to do. And then you add the transcripts from the public hearing to that packet. And then that becomes part of your submission, along with your board approvals, becomes part of your submission to EGLE. For us, it's EGLE for our SRF. So that was the SRF process. And I just wanted to share with you guys what we go through. We did recently get awarded a $11 million for lead service line replacements. As you know, well, I'm not sure if, I know we have other states here, but in the state of Michigan, there was the ruling passed. It's called the lead and copper rule, which requires the replacement of all lead service lines to the homes. So that means going from the water main in the street to the meter inside the home. However, the city is responsible from the water main in the street to the stop box, which is typically at the sidewalk, and the customer is responsible from the sidewalk inside the home at the meter. As a, you know, being proactive, what we do when we do water main replacement projects, if there are any known lead service lines, we do replace them at that time, but we cannot just, you know, fund replacing the lead service lines of homes, because again, it is private, and it is really difficult when you're having conversations with the community and they don't understand why you can't just replace everybody's lead service line. Again, we are funded by ratepayer dollars. And it's very difficult to explain certain things to customers when something is on their private side versus what's public. And that's usually the issue that we run into when we, you know, reach out to the community and we want to know what the community's needs are. Well, the community, typically their needs are for their own personal property, which is not the city's responsibility. And I'm just letting you know some of the obstacles that we have. And typically when we have a public hearing and we're speaking about what we're doing and we're saying, okay, we're replacing we're replacing the water main in the street, and the comments usually come back, you know, what about my home? I have lead, there's lead in the water. And we get a lot of discussions about that. And they kind of, you know, get sidetracked about what the focus is of the presentation. So that is all that I could think of to share with you about the SRF process. I do know that there were some additional questions about, you know, as far as opportunities for contractors to participate in work. I know there are questions about workforce development and affordability of the water. So I guess I want to first ask if we have any questions about SRF, and then I can continue on with the other questions.
Thank you, Monica. And I can most certainly see if anybody has any questions, like I said, you can most certainly raise your hand. All right, now, Monica, I have a question. It looks like you mentioned something I have heard before, utilities don't want to go after SRF funding. They would rather go out on the bond market to borrow money from the capital project. If a bond is easier than applying for SRF funding through the state, what would the state have to do to make the SRF more appealing than bonding for a utility?
When I say it's the SRF is more appealing. When I say it's more appealing because there's a loan forgiveness and we're a disadvantaged community, so it's more appealing because we are a disadvantaged community. If an entity applying for SRF is not disadvantaged, then I am not sure. Typically, the rates for SRF are lower, and the terms, I'm not sure if the terms for disadvantage, you get more options, meaning you have a 20, 30, or 40 year. And then on a typical bond, it is 30 year. But when I'm saying you go out to market, you have particular projects that you want to do, and I'm oversimplifying by saying it's easier to go out to the bond because with the project, if it is a water main replacement and the life of the asset is going to last longer than 30 years, that's a general requirement to go out for a bond. Whereas SRF, there is eligibility criteria and you have to submit a project plan and it's under review and you are competing with other communities for that funding. And there may be a limit as to the amount of funding that is available from that state organization, in my example, Eagle.
Okay. All right, thank you. And are there any current projects from Aaron Stanley that DWSD is considering applying for this new round of SRF grant money made available through Bill? If so, how can community groups get involved in helping develop those projects and identifying infrastructure needs?
So as part of, some of our priorities that we look at is the amount of failure. When I say failure, meaning on the water side, the water main breaks, the amount of water main breaks in areas. If there's multiple breaks, then that asset is reviewed or there's a condition assessment done on that asset. If there is maybe a flow issue, meaning, community, some communities build up in their areas. And when they build up, there's a greater demand for water. And let's say we had a 6-inch water main in those areas, and then the population is increasing, then there may be a greater demand. And then I'm not sure how we would know if the pressure or there's enough flow going to the homes without someone in the community speaking up and letting us know. As far as the community groups being involved, let's see, I know the GOWA has community meetings. DWSD does not currently hold, other than your neighborhoods. There are community meetings in the neighborhoods. And if there are any concerns, then we encourage the people to attend the community meetings and let them know, let your city council member know, and then also letting us know, letting me know. And then I can share that with our engineering group. What typically happens is when we ask the community for assistance, they typically tend to focus on private issues. And I did address that earlier. Private issue meaning a lead service line or sewer issue at a home. And those are private matters that we don't typically get funding to help with that. There's usually some funding opportunities out there that can assist homeowners. That's part of the affordability topic.
Okay, all right, thank you. And I can check in the participants list. Does anybody have any additional questions for Monica here?
I did want to, I have a couple more slides and I did want to talk about, you can go to the next slide.
Thank you.
Okay, the next slide, this is, we did recently have a vendor outreach where if there were construction contractors that wanted to participate in our bidding process. The criteria, what we typically look for is here, the city of income tax clearance, meaning are you up to date on your taxes for your entity? Are you recognized as a Detroit-based business? And this is all done through the city's website. And I will have a slide presentation available to the participants of this meeting afterwards. And we post our bid opportunities on Mitten. And again, you can go to the next slide. And here are the websites for that. And what I always like to share is that most of our projects are, multi-million dollar projects. We typically do not have the facilities. We have smaller projects, but our contractors that we typically have about 3 contractors that normally bid on everything that we put out, meaning the infrastructure where it's a water main replacement, a sewer investigation and replacement or condition assessments, but they're always looking for smaller contracts. So our opportunities are not only through DWSD, but they're through our prime contractors. For example, I'm part of an organization called NABWIC. It's the National Association of Black Women in Construction. And I've attended meetings and I've had small contractors say, hey, I have a trucking business, I have a landscaping business, or I do lead surface line replacements, but I don't have the bond capacity to do a multi-million dollar project with DWSD. How can I get involved, or how can I be part of this? And my answer to them is, hey, I can set you up with some of our contractors. A landscaper, for example, we have green infrastructure projects, and there's always some plantings and things that need to be planted as part of the green infrastructure to divert water from going into the street and the sewer. We set up green infrastructure projects, and then there's maintenance on those green infrastructure projects where someone will have to prune and cultivate and cut the grass and things like that. Trucking, again, with the water main replacement, you have to dig a trench and remove the concrete. Contractors that do concrete work can come back and replace that. And then again, on the restoration for if we have to dig in the berm, meaning between the sidewalk and the street, then a landscaper would again be needed to replant the grass there. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, you can go to the next slide, was the affordability. And one project that the mayor and the director of DWSD, Gary Brown, on the 7th of February, they had a presentation where they are doing, it's called a basement backup protection program. And again, when we talk about what the community needs are and any suggested projects, they tend to talk about private, and this is a private matter, but we have ARPA funds, and ARPA is part of the American Rescue Plan Act money. And what we're doing is some of the areas, in late June, there was a flooding event in Detroit, and it was considered to be a natural disaster by President Biden, and there was funding available. And so what this does is put the backflow preventer in the home, in the outlet of the home, going into the sewer, which would prevent it from backing up into the home. So as part of this program, the homeowner would pay 10% of the cost. We have plumbers that would go out, do an assessment to see what it would take to install this. They usually dig into the basement subflooring and then put the backflow preventer in there. And then some of them, they may be available to have a sub pump. Again, this is a private matter. It is funded by ARPA dollars. We're hiring plumbers, and there's 2 target neighborhoods right now, and they're a pilot to see how it will work. And then once we see how the program works and how fast we can get out to homes, get them installed, because you have to have 2 visits. One, our BC, which is Building Safety, Engineering, and Environmental, they go out and do an inspection to make sure it will be feasible for the home to be able to do this. They get the permit. Once they get the permit, then the plumber can come out and do the work. And then the project will be complete. Again, like I said, the homeowner has to pay a portion of this. So this is one attempt that we have to help with the flooding in the city of Detroit. And then the next slide is talking about an affordability program we do with Wayne Metro. It's called WRAP. It's the Water Assistance Program. It's the Water Residential Assistance Program, get the R in there. And this is based on income. And so homeowners or even tenants, they could apply for the WRAP program. And the WRAP program will assist in paying the water bill, and it will assist in paying the arrears. There are a couple of other programs. Again, with the WRAP program, DWSD can let Wayne Metro know, hey, we have a customer that needs assistance, and we can pretty much get the customer into the program. But there's other programs that we can't get the we're not able to get the customer sign up. They have to sign up. And right now there's some funding that is not being used because, as you know, we have the moratorium on shuts, meaning if someone's not paying their water bill, we can't shut them out because of COVID. We did have a restart program that started in March and ended in October, where if there was any customer that did not have water in their house, they contacted us or some of the other action agencies in the city of Detroit. And we did have funding. We went out and turned their water on. And typically there's two reasons why people's water were being shut off. One is because they weren't paying their bill, and two is because they didn't have the proper setup or they had too many water leaks. And part of the program, the restart program, we were able to go out and fix and complete minor repairs to get the customer set up. Meaning if you went out to set up a meter in a home and the connection on both sides, you weren't able to do it with that restart program, there was plumbing available to do that. Again, DWSD does not have plumbers that do work inside of the homes. This is something that's done because plumbing work on inside the home is considered private matter. But with that restart program, we were able to do that. And I am hearing that there will be some other programs similar that will be available. Again, this WRAP, the one that's on the screen now, they allow up to $2,000 worth of work. So that if there is a minor plumbing issue, the city is also coming out with it's a lead fixture replacement program, because typically when people complain about water, lead in their water, it is because they have old lead fixtures in their home. And there is a program coming out. I do not have that information yet. Once it's formulated, I will share with the group so you can understand a little more about that. But again, the purpose of that is to replace like faucets in the home that are lead fixtures. And that's it for me today.
That's fantastic, Monica. And yes, any information, would you be open and willing to be able to share this information in these slides, these programs available?
Yes, it's going to be more than just a slide. I just took a page or two out of other presentations. So I will be sharing all of that with you, and you can distribute it to the participants.
Fantastic. Okay, and before moving forward from this great information, does anybody? Okay, Monica is asking, could you share how this information is shared? Much of this information is online, and 50% of residents are challenged to access web-based information.
Right. So the information is shared. It is shared online. We do have community groups or neighborhood groups, and we do attend those. I'm not sure if Brian made it on the call, but we do attend those meetings, and we do share information at those meetings as well. Brian, do you want to address that?
Yeah, sure, be happy to. Good morning. Brian Peckinpah, DWSD Public Affairs Director. We are embarking this spring on a campaign to go door to door to households that are low income to let them know about these programs. We know that there is some digital divide, and that with how the pandemic has unfortunately played out, it's provided a disconnect. And we know that folks are coming to community meetings like this on Zoom and not in person, so we don't have that direct contact. So we are going to invest the money to go door to door to low-income households and speak with them about the programs that are available. We will have about an 8-month campaign. It will take us some time to go to every house that's eligible for the program. So we're going to embark on that as early as April to do the outreach.
Okay, thank you. And Brian, if you wouldn't mind, could you share the list of orgs so that we may direct our residents to these meetings? Question from Monica Lewis Patrick.
Oh, so we work with several community organizations. In the past, pre-pandemic, we worked with DABO and Second Ebenezer Fellowship Chapel and several organizations to have customer assistance days. But due to the pandemic, there's very limited in-person activities. So we are changing our strategy to go door to door. It will actually be people associated with DWSD and our contractors that will go door to door to do this outreach, not the community groups.
Okay, Brian, thank you. Does anybody have any other question? One last question before we move forward.
Brandon, good
Yes.
question for Brian. How are your people going to be identifying themselves to the residents?
When they go door to door, they will say that they're a representative of the Detroit Water Department and they want to share some information about the programs that are available. The main point here is that, and I think Monica might have touched on this a little bit. These programs, some of these are short term. Once the money's gone, if they don't apply this year, the funding may not be available next year. The low income household water assistance program, which was passed as part of the American Rescue Plan Act, is a pilot. We hope there's a permanent program. We're working towards that. Our director, Gary Brown, is actually on an EPA committee, is lobbying for that federally. But yeah, we are really encouraging people to sign up that are eligible for these programs now. As some of these, we know Sarah is not a permanent program, and LIWAP we hope is a permanent program, but right now it's only a pilot.
So are you going to put this information out into the public arena so people know that that you whoever's going to be going out doing the door to door is actually a person from DWSD versus the possibility that someone may use that as an excuse to scam people?
They will be marked with DWSD clothing. They will be official. They'll have ID, and they'll have a door hanger. So if the person is not home, they'll leave information behind and a phone number to call to get information about the programs. And if by chance the home has since been vacated, they'll make note of that so we know that for future too as well. And if we possibly need to go back to that home if it is occupied. So there will be a thorough process where, again, we're going to embark on an 8-month program. So we will make at least one visit, possibly 2 visits, depending on the status of the occupants.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And we actually have one last question before moving forward from Aaron Stanley. Could these SRF funds from the bill be used to expand the basement protection program to more neighborhoods and keep it going for more long term?
There's two parts to this question. One is with the ARPA funding that we are doing a pilot project. The pilot project is estimated at 2.5 million. And once we see how that project is going with the participation, We do have some additional ARPA funding that will be available to expand the program to all of the City of Detroit residents. And again, we are using a pilot to determine the interest. As far as using the SRF process, I'm not sure. And the reason why I'm not sure is because typically the projects that we're doing are not residentially focused. But if there is any funding available for a project that does focus on a residential home, then we would definitely look into that.
Understood. Thank you. All right. Not seeing any more questions. I would like to thank Monica Daniels and Brian Peckinpah for your time and sharing this information and answering questions. I'm going to move to community-driven SRF projects that will be presented by our Freshwater Futures Executive Director, Jill Ryan. So Jill, whenever you're ready, I would like to open the space for you.
Thank you, Brandon. Wow, what a great lineup we've had so far, from national level to local, and then to a specific example in Detroit. And now we're going to talk about how other communities can also make sure you're taking advantage of these funds. We know they're going to be a once in a lifetime investment from the federal government. We haven't seen this kind of investment for decades. Early in the last century, the commitment from the federal government was around 70% of costs to local water systems, and that has dwindled to 7% in recent years. And so it's welcome to see this big investment from the federal government. And so what I'm going to talk about is how everyone on the call can rally their own community if your community either hasn't been receiving SRF funds or haven't been receiving as much as you'd like to, or if there hasn't been sufficient community engagement in those projects. So that's going to be the focus of this. I also wanted to just put a few clarifications out there for All About Water. All About Water that is hosting this event is a group of groups, many groups across the Great Lakes region, who meet monthly as a leadership committee, and they host these events at least annually to try and provide educational seminars on water issues. And one of the things that they do is put out clarification and definitions on a regular basis. One of those is, I want to clarify that from All About Water's perspective, and certainly Freshwater Futures, there's a difference between assistance, water assistance, and water affordability. So water affordability means the rates that a family might be paying do not cross a certain threshold of their household income. So that might be 2% to 5%, depending on who's defining that. But there is a limit of how much of your household income would be paying for drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater fees. And so that is called affordability, long-term rates that match your income. Assistance is different in that it's often, it doesn't create rates that are affordable, but it helps through often short-term programs. So it's a program that like RAP that Monica referenced, that is based on need at a particular time. And All About Water knows there is a difference and that we probably need both, but we are all really advocating for affordability, rates that can match those incomes that we have. And so, you know, that's part of why we're talking today, especially with 49% of some of these funds being forgivable, so they are not loans. That can really help prevent rate increases, because if you can replace lead sewer lines, if you can do upgrades to a system, put in stormwater facilities that will prevent flooding from climate change. All of those things help to keep rates affordable or move toward affordability if you don't have to raise ratepayers with those monies to pay back those monies. So that's one clarification, affordability versus assistance. And I also want to talk a little bit at the end of this. I'll just let you know that I'm going to talk more about disadvantaged communities. So we'll get started. If I can go to my next slide, please, Lana. Excellent. So what we have sent everybody prior to today is a set of resources that we hope you'll find useful. And if there are ways we can improve those, we would love to hear about that. So please do give us feedback. One of those is a plan for how you can work with your local municipality, as we said, to move forward, make sure that they are applying for these dollars and that they are working with residents in the community to make sure the projects they're putting forward are the ones that residents see as most needed. So as an example, what I'm going to do is walk us through replacing lead service lines as a project. And so if you want your municipality to replace the service lines in the most economically challenged neighborhoods at no cost, and you could use forgivable SRF funding, you could do that without needing to raise the rates. Next slide, please. So if that's our goal, we want to think through what would a strategy look like. So we're just giving you one example of a strategy that you could use with your local municipality. So some of the things that you want to think about: who is making the decision? Who in your municipality gets to decide if it's possible to move forward with a state revolving fund application? Who does that work? Is that the water utility director, the mayor's office? Maybe like in the case of DWSD, it's someone in a different department. So you want to really do your research to find out who is the decision maker in my community. And if you find that decision maker isn't open to this goal, then you might also talk to your city council and others to try and find inroads to make sure your community is getting a good share of these funds. Next slide, please. Once you know who that decision maker is, it's really important to think about who are the people that make the best messengers with those decision makers. I'm not always the best decision maker with someone local. Sometimes I have better contacts with legislators at the state level. It's thinking through those pieces about who does the decision maker or decision makers, who do they listen to? And trying to figure out paths to go talk to them so that you can get a connection to those decision makers. Next slide, please. Then beyond who delivers the message, we have to have a good message. So what messages will impact those decision makers? You know, there are lots of ways to talk about even things like lead service lines. And I think looking at some of the difficulties that Monica was talking about earlier that municipalities have to deal with, you still have to be able to pay the bills at the water utility. So utilizing funds, especially if they can be forgivable or grants, is really important to several things. One is improving health in the community. We know that if you are not drinking lead in your water, that is a positive health benefit. Two, you can talk about the ability for the water utility to be able to get ahead of its replacement, especially in places like Michigan where you have a deadline for those lead line replacements. You can also talk about the fact that this is could be a program if you qualify where you don't have to pay that money. Therefore, you shouldn't have to raise rates. So there are a lot of messages that you can tailor to the specific decision makers, depending on what is important to them. Next slide, please. So some of the methods in order to prepare are to do that research we've talked about, getting out there, seeing what decision makers are saying. They have probably said things in papers or in online fora about what they plan to do in terms of the water utility. Also, hold meetings. It's really important that our communities are participating in this, because we all as residents, we want to be the stewards of our own water, and the only way to do that is to understand what's happening, how we get our water, how it gets paid for, what kinds of projects are going to be conducted in our own community. And that really creates ownership among the whole community, rather than this sort of, we're just customers and the utility is providing the service. So really trying to engage as much of the community as possible, and then moving that information that you can collect from the community back to those decision makers. If you're able to show that a great number of residents have weighed in and share those comments with the city, that can really be helpful in terms of moving them toward the kinds of projects that community is interested in. There are other topics as well, of course, in terms of methods. You can use research that others have done. There's good polling information out there often. And we've heard from a couple of people on the call already, from Healing Our Waters, for example. They have great messaging about water. And so being able to utilize those resources that others have created to help create your messages. Let's go to the next slide, please. So another piece is to make sure we're working with allies. Who might those be? That could be local neighborhood associations or block clubs in your city. It could be environmental water focus groups, potentially state, regional, or national groups that can bring you some expertise to help you put together your ask for the city. And also those elected officials, hopefully they're going to be on board. They want to get resident input and make sure there is good buy-in and ownership for these kinds of projects. So we shouldn't assume that we're going to have to take an advocacy stance. We hopefully will be able to have more of a partnership relationship with our communities and move projects forward that way. So really look at your allies who might be able to help in these conversations. Next slide, please. So in terms of some other tools that you can access, there's messaging research on all of these issues, stormwater, especially with floods that we've seen across lower Michigan, for example, in Detroit and other cities, very large floods due to climate change that we're going to have to address going forward. These are probably not just isolated events. So getting some good information about that can really help make your case. The city likely also has good information on flooding, and so you might be able to access that information to help make a case. Your group can also collect your own stormwater data if you think that would be helpful. Freshwater Future has a stormwater app. It's a mobile app on people's phones or tablets that they can take pictures of issues when there's a storm event that get uploaded, and you can use those with your municipality. So if you're interested in those kinds of tools, we're happy to help you provide training and get you going on those tools. Additionally, Freshwater Future is going to make some small grants available for communities to get this work done. So if you need money for organizing, for the meeting costs, for having food, so you can get people together, for having Zoom, so you can get people online if that's how you're going to do it. You can contact Lori at freshwaterfuture.org on our staff to help you access those dollars. We want to make sure that we're removing as many of those hurdles as we can to get you going on securing these funds for your community. Next slide, please. So we talked a lot from the beginning of today, all through the morning, about this definition of disadvantaged communities. And I'm going to send you or put a link in the chat box in terms of where you can find that for the state of Michigan. And you can access all of those things online generally. But it is really important to know what those definitions are, whether they're meeting the needs of communities right now. And if they're not, we need to go and advocate with the state to change those, whatever state we're in. So, for example, in Michigan, it is based on median household income, but it's also, some of it is also based on a population of less than 10,000. And the link I just put in the chat on page 15, because it's a long document, you can find that definition. But what All About Water has done is come up with this definition that you have on the screen right now, thinking that we think this is a better way to define. So project areas, neighborhoods, or political subdivisions with significant representation of low-income communities, communities of color, or tribal and indigenous communities that experience or are at risk of experiencing higher or more adverse human health, environmental effects, or unaffordable rates. So we're really trying to capture the things that create need for these kinds of funding opportunities. So you can access this here. We'll also make sure that you can access this. We'll have a page of resources from today's event that you'll all get a link to, and you'll be able to access all of these things from there. But it's really important that we not only advocate with our local municipality to go out and apply for these dollars and make sure they're listening to residents in that process, but also that we tell the states that the definitions are critical. We need them to be focused on getting these into communities in need. And so we think this definition can help with that.
Jill, you have a few more moments before wrap up time comes.
Thank you, Brandon. Next slide, please. All right, so that's actually the wrap for me, except if we have any questions. Just trying to look through here to see if there were any questions on this topic.
Okay. And again, if there are any other questions that come up late in a later time, you can either send me or you can send Jill an email with any questions that you have. And we're going to be moving into the advocacy portion where we're going to be raising voices for the community, and the people who are going to be helping us do that are Michael Harris from the Flint Community Lab, and also Monica Lewis Patrick from We the People of Detroit. So to kick it off, Brother Mike, are you here with us? Okay, and that is all right. We can most certainly give him time to come with us and join. Monica Lewis Patrick, are you with us?
Yes, sir. I am here, Mr. Titus. How are you, sir?
I am fantastic and feeling good that you're here with us too. I'm super excited to hear what you have to share with us. I would love to open the space for you and really be able to give insight for all of us if you could.
Well, first, just would really like to thank Freshwater Futures, Jill Ryan, yourself, and all of the amazing team that's put together a super duper presentation from federal to state to local examples of state revolving funds. Now it's time for us to get busy at the grassroots and community level and making sure we can connect the dots. And so some of what we really want to talk about is how can these federal funds become available in a way that's meaningful for us. We know that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to just repair and modernize our infrastructure, and with more forgivable options, especially with grants. And we want to take note of that. In the past, those dollars have been loans. This particular moment gives us an opportunity to grab these grant dollars that will be extremely meaningful to the cost of water in our municipalities. And we heard both from Monica and from Jill that if we connect the dots from those federal dollars to the state down to our local municipalities, that it really should be done in a way where those dollars are not being shifted in a way, that debt is not being shifted in a way to the ratepayers. Delayed maintenance and the need to replace lead service lines, new contaminants and other circumstances are making it harder to cover the cost of water without raising rates. And we understand that. And I think sometimes because of the struggle we've had in communicating with our utilities, sometimes we hear them talk in this very wonky, scientific, and very complicated language. And we just want to get to the nuts and bolts of how we as communities can take these dollars, apply political pressure, use our advocacy and our voice to bring our communities into the room to not only make sure that the utility is getting the money that it needs to provide the proper services, quality water, to sustain whatever the debt obligations are, but at the same time, we must be able to ensure that water for every person in our municipalities is clean, safe, and affordable. Often water systems have been made to upgrade and secure funding without resident input. As we heard from Jill, there is a methodology in terms of engaging your community. We know that we have to show up and use research. We have to use data. We can use some of the research and data that's been done by some of our partners and some of our advocates and allies. Some of that information has been placed in the chat. We also know that we have friends from the federal government all the way down to our municipal government. As we demonstrated now, sometimes you may have a difficult relationship with your water director or your mayor, but there are ways to be able to amplify your concerns and maybe use an advocate or an ally that you have through another organization to convene a meeting and be able to bring your concerns to bear. Because we know this money is coming and the playing field has never been even, we must be a part of ushering in what is going to make the difference in water systems, and not just water systems, water equity, water justice. This is an important time for residents to create a way to ensure that there is input and that they are heard. And what we know as activists and organizers and mobilizers at the grassroots level, sometimes when they don't want to hear you, you have to make them hear you. So it says to us, we've got to show up at some of these meetings that sometimes our schedules are hard to accommodate. So that means you've got to go to your water board meeting. The persons that are making decisions about your rate and your access, you've got to go to your council persons, educate them on your concerns, the legislative needs that you have. But you've also got to say to your administrators and your water directors and utilities that you need them to combine these funds with a workforce development strategy so that a high tide will lift all boats. It will do no good to have contracts and opportunities come into our community, but what we have seen over and over historically, for many legacy Black communities, those dollars are still gifted to contractors in the suburbs that have the capacity to move on these opportunities quickly. So we must begin to use the tools at our disposal. We must use all the expertise that we have available to make sure that we're taking advantage of all of these opportunities in our community. Now is the time to get out and organize neighborhoods, to show that municipalities, that residents support and secure, want these funds to be secured, but it's going to be important that the water system is inviting this as an opportunity to tie bar this new funding, some of it incredible legacy opportunities of funding. You must tie bar it to a water affordability strategy. And so as we talk about these opportunities, we're not going to let municipalities or utilities off the hook that they can't be a part of building the consensus of equity and justice in our community. And we're so grateful for what was shared about what can happen with states at the state level, that state legislators, water is a bipartisan issue. And this can become a wonderful way for our rural partners and our urban partners and suburban partners to say with one voice that you will not divide us or pit us against each other, that we recognize that this is equally a time to be able to invest in rural communities and make sure that they have the technical support and assistance that they need to access these dollars and sustain the necessary paperwork and administrative costs. But at the same time, we're also saying that you cannot neglect the fact that many of our urban cores that are extremely Black and brown communities must have an opportunity to take advantage of the jobs and the contracts that are coming with these investments. And so we have an opportunity to work together among urban, rural, and tribal communities. And I don't want to leave out the fact that even though there are designated dollars for tribal communities, it is always important that we are connecting the dots, that we are one family. We are a human family that is invested in the human right to clean, safe, and affordable water. Now, what I am challenging you to do as All About Water, all hands on deck to ensure that these funds get to most impacted, disadvantaged communities. Thank you so much. And Jill Ryan, I'll turn it back over to you and to Brandon. You've all been deputized.
Let's get the job done.
Right? Because they're registered, they know where their polling location is. When you make a traffic demand.
Absolutely. And thank you. I just ensure just a little bit longer, but thank you, Monica, for raising this voice and understanding the importance of the situations that we're facing and understanding that we are walking in a great direction, but there is much more left to be done. And I want to be able to reach out to Mike one more time. Michael Harris, are you here with us?
It sounds like Mike has been having some
Internet
connection issues, Brandon. Yeah.
Yes.
But huge thanks to Monica for that energetic response. And I think I would suggest if we have any other questions or people want to have a little bit of conversation, we can have a few minutes for that. So I'll leave that to you, Brandon.
With that, I think that's an open invitation to everybody on the call. We are moving into the conclusion of this symposium, so we can open it up. And if anybody has any comments or questions, most certainly make this more of a relaxing space.
Hello, Horace Schmidt here. I just want to thank Monica. You know, she always lights a fire under me, and I suspect everyone else who listens to her. And I really appreciate that, the energy that she puts forth. The question I have is, living in the rural part of the state, is there anything happening with the state agriculture and rural development and USDA rural development funds? Does anyone have any information on that right now?
That's a great question, Horst. And this is Jill. I do not have information about how that might relate here today, but if anyone else on the call has that, we'd be happy to hear from you. I do know, Horst, however, that the funds, at least as disadvantaged community is still defined by Eagle at this point for Michigan, there are extra points potentially given to rural communities just based on size. So if you're a community less than 10,000, that is still one of the criteria for assistance. So that is a possible help, but I don't know about those other programs.
Okay, well, thank you. I just wanted to check because you know, we've been getting very good service from both of these agencies up here in the UP, and it's the reason why we have our updated sewer system and water systems in our little towns as they deteriorate, have deteriorated over the decades when they were built by the mining companies. So that's why I was wondering if anything had gone in that direction. But I'm very, very happy that the urban areas are getting their due after all these decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Horst. And I do want to say that we know everybody on this call is certainly wanting everyone else to also get help. And that's really the goal here. We also will make contacts available. So if you have questions that another participant might be able to help with, let us know. We'll make sure you can get in touch with them, because there's a lot of expertise here from rural, urban, many other aspects. So we want to make sure that you can find those answers you need. Are there any other questions or comments? All right. Well, I do know that there will be a survey as you close out of this. There will be a survey, and that helps us to continue to provide these programs and provide them in the best way for you. So please do take just a minute. It's only 2 questions. If you could give us some information, that would be great. And I will turn it back to you, Brandon.
It's actually 4 simple questions, but it'll take
4
about the
simple.
same amount of time as 2.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, so with those rollout, those survey questions, Alana, are you going to be pulling those up?
They'll show up once everyone leaves the call.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, you all heard it. Please expect the survey questions after this symposium is complete. But again, like Joe said, if there aren't any other questions, I just want to say I like to thank everybody in your time, and we really like to say that we do make sure that we respect everybody's time and make sure that we're able to step forward on these important matters. Thank you to all the participants that really helped in making this call such an impactful call. And I just would really like to encourage everybody to have a great rest of your day. Please answer the survey, and look forward to meeting with all of you again. If anybody has any other questions, you can most certainly email me. I'll put my email in the chat one more time. As I'm talking, I can't say I'm the best person to do 2 things at once, but it seems like I'm succeeding. And everybody, my email is in the chat. Please have a wonderful day, and yes, take care.
Thank you.
This wonderful group of engaged folks, and of course we can
Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Bye.